Everything is binary. There needs to be nuance in any conversation, I think. And you can say that CaitlinClark is the face of the league, the sole reason for the success, but also acknowledge that there is popularity amongst the other players, right? Like last year when CaitlinClark played in the playoffs, they averaged 2.2 million viewers for those 2 games she played. But with a little bit of collateral effect from her presence, the finals was the most watched in a really, really long time, with over 1 million viewers for the 5-game series. And I think that's carried over as the New York Liberty are one of the more popular teams this year. So I think there's just a need for nuance. It's very important to acknowledge, though, first off, that CaitlinClark is a singular entity, perhaps the biggest sole business, needle mover that exists in sports right now. But there is collateral effects that come from that.
We're talking off air about the WNBA All-Star Weekend. You're headed there, so let's start with the W first. After recording of this podcast, CaitlinClark recently re-aggravated an injury, so it's unknown about her status for the WNBA All-Star Weekend. Just overall, painting a picture for this first half of the season. She's been hurt, dealing with a lot of injuries, but yet there's been a lot of exciting rookies this year. Seems to be very competitive within the WNBA, but yet the narrative always seems when CaitlinClark gets hurt, there's a lot of usually, I think, negative thoughts, negative comments discussed around this league whenever CaitlinClark's not involved. So what do you assess from a business aspect of how the league is doing in your mind?
Yeah, I think if you look at social media, everything is black and white, right? Everything is binary. There needs to be nuance in any conversation, I think. And you can say that CaitlinClark is the face of the league, the sole reason for the success, but also acknowledge that there is popularity amongst the other players, right? Like last year when CaitlinClark played in the playoffs, they averaged 2.2 million viewers for those 2 games she played. But there, with a little bit of collateral effect from her presence, the finals was the most watched in a really, really long time, with over 1 million viewers for the 5-game series. And I think that's carried over as the New York Liberty are one of the more popular teams this year. So I think there's just a need for nuance. It's very important to acknowledge, though, first off, that CaitlinClark is a singular entity, perhaps the biggest sole business, needle mover that exists in sports right now. But there is collateral effects that come from that, and I think are now spilling over to the rest. The Fever players, I've talked to people at the organization, are extremely popular. Not just CaitlinClark right now. When you go to the arena, obviously there's a lot of CaitlinClark jerseys, but I think there's a lot of, Sophie Cunningham jerseys now. There's a lot of Leah Boston jerseys that are starting to come around as they watch them play more. And also, I think in the rest of the league, right? I just, wrote a story out today that the attendance numbers are through the roof right now, are on pace to set the record average-wise in the WNBA. And that's not driven by the Fever. That's driven by the Golden State Valkyries selling out all 11 games. And that's also driven by the New York Liberty, who decided to open up their arena, the Barclays Center, to more fans. And are at a low of 14,000 this year and highs of 17,000. They didn't even have 14,000 of a capacity for every single game, in previous years. So when you're looking at attendance, yes, CaitlinClark is driving a lot of it. That we could say that, but there's nuance. I think that's really the big thing here. And the WNBA is at an inflection point, but it's really growing right now.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think the league has done a great job since 2020 of capitalizing on its momentum, starting with the Wubble, and then even with Sabrina Ionescu, and then to CaitlinClark and Angel Reese for the rest of the rookie class to now. I want to focus on the Valkyries because that is a very interesting story. We've talked to Zena Keita of The Athletic, who also is an analyst, as well as a reporter who was at the first game. And there's a lot of interest within this team. In your mind, what did the Valkyries do right to make sure that all their home games sell out? And is Portland, Detroit, the rest of the WNBA expansion paying attention to this and using this as a framework? Or do you think they'll go into their own direction, kind of do their own thing? Because I think the blueprint's right there in terms of what the right steps is to make sure that you're successful your first year. Do you think the other teams that are going to get WNBA teams in the future can replicate that success?
Yeah, I think there was a reason why the Valkyries were the first expansion team since 2008. They knew that the preparation was there from a franchise that showed its success with the Warriors, and I think you're starting to see that right now. Like it or not, the WNBA is choosing expansion franchises that are with, that have NBA ties, right? Even Portland and Toronto, not owned necessarily by the majority owners of their NBA teams, but they're owned by, people with ownership groups that have professional sports and have minority ownerships in NBA teams. So I think Golden State was a, calculated decision by the league, a big market, but also one that knew how to run its team. Joe Lacob knew how to run the team. I spoke to Natalie Nakase when she was hired, immediately after she was hired, and right away Joe Lacob looked at her and said, "I want to win a championship in 5 years." And I know it sounds funny, but I think that when you hear it from people who've done it before, there's a certain level of oomph, badly put, that comes with that, right? And obviously, there's all the business behind that. But when you have a team that has shown, they're the most successful NBA franchise of the last decade or two, right? In terms of success on the court, but also the valuation of the Warriors from 20 years ago is night and day from where they are now. And so they've shown how to make a successful business. And the Valkyries, I think, are the example. Now, if you look at the other teams, I think, they have different situations, perhaps smaller markets like Cleveland and Detroit, but they have ownership groups. I spoke to the CEO of the Rock Entertainment Group just yesterday, and he stressed on the fact that they have all the infrastructure ready, that their practice facility is going to be a new one for the NBA team, and then the WNBA team is going to come in to the NBA team's current practice facility. That's just not seen as often around the WNBA, and clearly a priority. So I think the precedent is there with the Valkyries, and they're setting an example. But honestly, I don't think anyone would have expected just how successful they are right now, at least on the court.
So, what do you make of the WNBA in terms of the cities that they have picked for expansion? You mentioned that they wanted to go with cities with NBA ties. Do you think they're done with expansion for now, or do you think they're going to keep on being aggressive? This is quite a lot for a league to add so many teams in such a quick time span. Do you think they continue being this aggressive, or do you think these are the teams that they have in mind for expansion for now, and then they'll reevaluate maybe in the next, I would say decade or so?
Yeah, I think it's going to be telling what happens in terms of their growth for the next few years, right? Um, Kathy Engelbert said during the announcement press conference, she said that Houston, she outright named Houston as a potential option still on the cards. Obviously, they have an NBA team as well, a successful NBA franchise there. So I think that that's going to be in the cards. I looked at you look at other leagues like Major League Soccer. They've expanded quite significantly over the last decade or two. So I think if the success is there, they signed their media rights deal, the WNBA, alongside the NBA, but they have opportunity to still continue to get more partners. They signed one with Ion, but CBS has not signed yet. And maybe that becomes a bigger opportunity for them. Maybe that's who takes more of the pie when they decide to expand their number of games, if they do that in the CBA. So if that's the case, then maybe they have more money to go around and maybe they expand a little bit more. But I think that it's really going to matter what the success is for the next couple of years. And it's going to be important to see just how successful Portland and Toronto are when they come in next season.
So you brought up the CBA. I've talked to other WNBA journalists, and their opinions is that Unrivaled might play a factor in these negotiations in terms of using it as leverage. Now, it was mentioned with Nafisa Collier and Brianna Stewart about their involvement with Unrivaled and how that's going to play in with the CBA negotiations. What do you make of that? Is that going to be a factor? Is that blown out of proportion? Do you think this is strictly a WNBA discussion in terms of the players gaining what they want? And also to that point, I'm wondering, a lot's been focused on salary, which is important, but are the players focused on other things too in terms of just their player advocacy? I know charter flights was such a huge thing over the past couple of years, but are they focused on gaining just, you know, stuff that the WNBA, stuff that the NBA already has that they should be already be getting as a WNBA player? Like, are there other aspects of the CBA they're focused on besides just the salary part?
Yeah, I think in terms of Unrivaled, I think it's difficult to say whether that will outright be said during discussions. I think there's a lot of valid concerns about whether it's a conflict of interest, right? Even though Nafisa Collier has kind of clapped back at it, I also understand Nafisa Collier's point. Um, but I think that where I stand on it is that it's impossible for it not to be a factor, um, whether or not it's directly mentioned in those meeting rooms because of the salary. And I think that was their whole, whether they want to admit it or not, that was part of the strategy, saying that, hey, look, we can pay our players this much and people are still willing to watch, for as modest as I think 300,000, 250,000 viewers were. For a new league, that was pretty okay. And considering all the new sponsorships they had, I also talked to someone from TNT, and the big thing was that the market is different. You're talking about women who are watching this game, right? And that's just so rare in sports to get that specific market where you're going to get, sponsorships from Sephora, in sports. That's so different. And so I think there's value in that. So going back, I think it's impossible for it not to be a factor. But just how much, I do see what Nafis is saying here, where it's like, ultimately we want to get more money. This is kind of, Unrivaled is just proof that they can get it. But I think this was due no matter what. Unrivaled just so happened to come a year before. Now, when it comes to your second question, could you just quickly repeat that one real quick?
Yeah, of course. Just in terms of when these negotiations go down, of course, salary is going to be probably the main point of discussion, and certainly a mainstream point that the media is going to run with. But I'm just wondering, are there other things that the players are focused on
Right.
as well when they're sitting down at the table with the league?
I think one thing is the expansion side, right? I know that kind of goes hand in hand with salaries, but I'm not talking about league expansion. I'm talking about roster expansion. There are 12 players per team. And just recently, the Indiana Fever and the Phoenix Mercury and the Los Angeles Sparks were all getting hardship contracts because if you lose 3 players, you need to get a hardship player. The NBA essentially has 18 players on their roster right now because of two ways and people who are playing in the G League, things like that. They are able to kind of make up for any injuries that might happen. That's not the case in the WNBA. Even just 1 or 2 players, I think, would help. But at the same time, that's another question about salary because 1 or 2 additional players will dilute the pot of revenue because you will have at least a minimum salary placed per team. But I think that is one of the big things, right? They want more slots in the league for more players. One thing that I think is worth watching, perhaps not as much externally, but I've had conversations where rules on player pregnancies are also very important. You mentioned earlier that it's what rules are similar to the NBA. The argument is what rules are just specific to the W actually, and one of that is player pregnancies. Nafisa Collier was treated fairly well by um the Lynx. But that's not necessarily the case, and we've seen it with someone like Dearica Hamby, right, with the Aces. So I think those little rules that may not be mainstream, but will play a factor, are what the players are kind of looking for as well.
No, that completely makes sense. To your best estimation, what do you think the players are specifically looking for? I think when there's this discourse about the salary of which the WNBA players are seeking, it always gets into the, they should get exactly what the men are getting. But you take a look at the economics and what you were mentioning earlier about nuance. I think it's about looking at the numbers and what the league can actually produce. So, and what the players are actually wanting compared to what the narrative is. So, when the players are sitting down negotiating, what exactly are they seeking in terms of salary, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a perception that it's the same salary, but I watched the video from Kelsey Plum 2 years ago. I remember it, and it was, I think, before CaitlinClark even made it to the WNBA, right? And Kelsey Plum basically said, we don't want equal salaries. We understand that that's the case. We just want equitable. We want it to be, and the problem is that in the WNBA, there's no revenue sharing. In the NBA, it's revenue sharing. It's 51-49, something like that, between owners and players. That's not the case in the W. In fact, as someone who reports on this, I can't tell you what it is because they don't disclose what exactly it is. Will there be revenue sharing in the CBA? I don't know, but that's going to be something that's interesting. Now, obviously, the WNBA is coming from a tough financial standpoint, and also 42% of the WNBA is owned by the NBA. So that's that's quite different. That's quite unique. I'm there might be nuances to that as well, but I still think that it's not necessarily making 9.2 million the average salary in the WNBA, but I don't think what the average salary is now, according to the Athletic, is 117,000. I think that there's room now, considering the growth. If you look at viewership, if you look at attendance, to at least put that up a little bit higher. I think the other question, though, is how much is that going to affect the league? The stark growth that's going to lead to. Because we saw the NBA in 2016, when there was a cap spike, things went crazy. How is that going to happen in the WNBA now? Because they might, deservedly get 2 times, 3 times if their salaries, but how is that going to affect, all the money, all the where the players are going? 80% of the league is a free agent this year. So, it's going to be very, very interesting to see how those play a factor as well.
Yeah, completely agree. Last question on the W. It seems that with the NBA on ESPN, there's always a huge debate on just their coverage. But yeah, I see on the W, they seem to have that on point the last few years, with their kind of the big three, with Shania Wumike, Elle Duncan, and Andrea Carter, and then with their commentators that they have. Seems like a very consistent pace with their coverage compared to the NBA side, where it just seems jumbled, especially from their front analysts and then their commentators as well. Can you kind of speak to the coverage and what's going to happen with the changing TV deals as well, with the W? What do you project there? Are you kind of seeing a kind of evolution in coverage? You mentioned CBS might be gaining more games. That, who knows, that might be a possibility. Ion has been pretty active. I've liked their coverage of the W as well. So what do you make of this TV coverage on the WNBA side? It's been a point of criticism, I know, for myself in the past, and I've seen a huge improvement, specifically with this decade.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a consensus. You're not going to please everyone, but I think there's a consensus that this big three right now, Andrea Carter being one of my favorite analysts, are doing so great for ESPN and for the W, and there's a lot of criticism with their NBA coverage, and I agree with that as well. I think one thing that I will note is that ESPN execs have acknowledged that they actually want the W to be distributed in other outlets, other networks, ultimately because it's a matter of volume, right? The ESPN and their networks can only take so much. And so if they're able to add volume with other outlets, with an Amazon, with an NBC, with an Ion, and potentially CBS, and maybe even more, there are going to be more platforms to get their games on national television, which you only have a limited supply of that, especially in this day and age, in this media landscape. So I think that there is really going to be more like the WNBA strategy is probably, as this media landscape grows, to just go into more places to distribute as much as possible, because they're only going to be able to get I think like 30-40 games on ESPN. They already have this locked in, but if they're growing more games, if their league continues to grow, they're going to have to get more streaming partners. They're going to have to get a CBS. So I can definitely see just more coverage. And I think in general, like, I work for a media company, and there's just one thing that we notice is that there's just little coverage of like people covering the W in general. And as the league grows, that's going to grow as well. More people are going to start covering, and there are going to be more faces on TV covering the W as well. I think that's just good all around. Maybe some people are going to come in with not as much knowledge. We talked about, when First Take started talking more about the W, but you'll see people come out of the woodwork that have really followed this and are going to get deserved shine.
That's an excellent point because I talked to a now analyst on CBS. She was a producer at ESPN with Tarika, and now she's been doing the color commentary. I think either color or she's a sideline analyst. Tarika Foster Braxby. She's a sideline analyst for the Connecticut Sun. You can see her evolution take shape, and some other journalists that we've talked to at first, they're covering the beat, and now they're getting more opportunities. So I think that's really good in terms of as not only the league grows, that the media landscape grows of journalists that have extensive knowledge. So I think that bodes well for the league coverages.